She was a black waitress. Nobody in that room gave her a second glance. Not the men in $10,000 suits. Not the bodyguards positioned like furniture along the walls. Not the grieving son in his Richard Mille watch, who looked at her for exactly 2 seconds and looked away. That was his first mistake, because Naomi Williams had been invisible her whole life, and invisible people see everything. She stood in the middle of a Korean mob funeral, 180 people, white lilies from floor to ceiling, a lacquered black coffin that no one was supposed to open, and she raised her voice in a room where raising your voice could get you killed. "I need someone to open this coffin, right now," because the man inside it was not killed by a cardiac arrest. And I have the documentation that proves it. The silence that followed was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of 180 people deciding whether what they had just witnessed was a disruption or a funeral for someone else entirely. She had photographed 6 pages from a private document she was never supposed to see. She had made 3 attempts to be heard: a lawyer, the police, a journalist, and every single door had closed in her face. Because that's what happens when a black woman walks into rooms built to keep her out. But she had one thing none of them had counted on. She had already lost someone to silence, and she had promised herself she would never do that again. What happened next shook that entire room to its foundation, and the man responsible for it all had been dead for 2 days. Before we begin the full story, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories about karma, love, and hidden truths move you, make sure you subscribe to the channel. She had learned, in the 3 years she spent carrying plates across polished floors, that the most dangerous rooms in the world do not look dangerous at all. The Beck Clan restaurant occupied the ground floor of a glass building on West Wacker Drive, and on any given Tuesday evening, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a place where Chicago's wealthiest ate fish that had been flown in that morning from Jeju Island, and drank wine that cost more than Naomi Williams made in a month. The walls were lacquered black, the lighting was warm and gold, and calculated to make everyone inside look important. The staff, all 12 of them, had been trained to move like water around furniture, refilling glasses before they were empty, anticipating needs before they were expressed, and above all, never, under any circumstances, appearing to notice anything. Naomi was very good at appearing to notice nothing. She had cultivated it as a skill the way a musician practices scales, not with joy, but with the understanding that it was the foundational thing, the thing everything else depended on. In this restaurant, in this particular corner of Chicago's West Loop, what you did not see could not get you killed. What you did not hear could not be used against you, and what you did not remember could not be pulled out of you in a parking garage at 2 a.m. by men with very patient hands and very specific questions. She had understood this without anyone ever telling her directly. You simply watched how the other servers moved, how their eyes slid past certain tables the way water slides past stone, and you learned. Jang Hyeon-Soo had his own table. Not in the sense that it was reserved under his name, because men like him did not reserve tables under their names. It was reserved in the sense that everyone who worked at the Beck clan understood, wordlessly, that when the man with the gray hair and the neck tattoos sat in the private booth near the back, you did not seat anyone within earshot. You brought his order without writing it down, and you did not refill his water glass unless he looked at you first. He had been coming in twice a week for as long as Naomi had worked there. She knew his order: ganjang gejang, aged black garlic, barley tea, no ice, and she knew his habits. He always arrived at 7:45. He always sat facing the door. He always left a cash tip in an envelope, the same amount regardless of how long he stayed or what he ordered, as though the tip were not for service, but for a kind of contractual silence. She had never spoken more than 4 sentences to him at once. On the Tuesday that would rearrange the architecture of her life, Naomi noticed something different the moment she turned the corner toward the back section. He was alone. In 3 years, she had never seen him alone. There were always men, sitting adjacent to him, standing near the entrance to the private hall, positioned at the bar in expensive casual clothing that did not quite conceal the particular way they held their weight. They were never introduced, never acknowledged, present the way certain pieces of furniture are present, not decorative, purely functional. A kind of human infrastructure. That night, there was no one, just the man himself, sitting in the private booth with a leather portfolio open on the table and a cup of barley tea he had not touched. He looked smaller without the architecture of men around him. Naomi noted this and filed it away in the part of her mind where she put things she was not paid to think about. She took his order. She brought his food. She moved like water. It was during the second pass, the quiet walk-by that servers do between courses, not stopping unless needed, just reading the table, that she noticed the portfolio had been pushed aside and several pages had slid off the edge. They lay scattered across the cushioned seat beside him, and he was not in the booth. He had stepped away. She could see the light under the door of the private restroom at the far end of the hall. The professional thing, the only thing, was to pick up the papers without reading them and set them back inside the portfolio. Naomi bent to gather them. Her eyes caught the header of the top page the way the eye catches a lit match in a dark room. Not deliberately, not with intention, but with that involuntary biological alarm that says, light, light, pay attention. Jang Hyeon-Soo, private toxicological screening, confidential. She did not stop moving. Her hands collected the pages with the same smooth efficiency she used to collect plates, and she set them back inside the portfolio. But she had already read further than the header, and the particular arrangement of words she had seen was now lodged somewhere behind her sternum like a splinter, small, not immediately catastrophic, but impossible to ignore once you became aware of it. She had worked at the Midtown Pharmacy on Michigan Avenue for 2 years before this job. Not as a pharmacist, she hadn't finished her degree, something she didn't let herself think about too often, but as a counter clerk who, out of grief and a need to understand what had happened to her brother Marcus, had spent every spare moment reading the pharmaceutical references behind the counter, asking questions the licensed staff found equal parts touching and exhausting. Marcus had died at 24. Heart failure, the certificate said. The kind of heart failure that, as Naomi had learned in the months afterward, looked almost identical under standard autopsy to the cardiac arrest induced by a particular class of glycoside drugs when administered carefully, in doses that accumulated slowly, in a patient whose other health markers would explain the outcome. She had never been able to prove anything about Marcus. She had been 26 and broke, and the only person in her family who understood what she was looking at, and that had turned out to be exactly not enough. The word on the page, the dosage notation, the specific compound, the handwritten margin note in red ink that said, lethality threshold at 72 hours, symptom window 0, landed in the part of her that had learned to read that particular vocabulary, out of love for a brother she could not save. She stood at the service station at the end of the hall. The restroom door was still closed. She had approximately 90 seconds. She took out her phone. She photographed every page. She put the phone back in her apron pocket, straightened the portfolio with the same composed hands that had never once dropped a dish in 3 years, and was refilling the water glass at table 12 when she heard the particular unhurried footsteps of Jang Hyeon-Soo returning to his booth. She did not look up. That night, on the train back to her apartment in Pilsen, she sat with the photos open on her phone and felt the particular coldness that comes not from fear, but from clarity. The moment when something you have suspected at a low, unexamined frequency suddenly resolves into a frequency you cannot tune out. The document was not a hospital record. It was private, commissioned from an independent laboratory she found in under 4 minutes of searching. The notation in red ink was not a doctor's observation. It was a calculation, Someone had worked out exactly how much of the compound would be needed, exactly how long it would take, and exactly why no standard examination would catch it. The man who had commissioned the report was not a doctor. He was the subject. She turned off her phone screen and watched the city move past the train window, and she thought about Marcus, and she thought about the envelope of cash he left every week for silence, and she thought about the portfolio sitting open on the table, with the pages half scattered as though someone had left them there in a moment of distraction, or in a moment of terrible, calculated precision. She did not sleep that night, and in the morning, the news notification arrived at 6:42. Prominent Chicago businessman Jang Hyeon-Soo found deceased in Gold Coast residence. Preliminary cause, cardiac arrest. Age, 58. Naomi read it twice. Then she got up, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, completely still, the way she sat when she was not appearing to notice something. Except this time, she had already noticed everything. She had made 3 attempts before she walked into that funeral. The first was the lawyer, a man named Gerald Okafor, whose office she found through a legal aid directory, who listened to her for 11 minutes before he interrupted her with the particular gentleness of someone delivering news they have delivered many times before. He had leaned forward over his desk, folded his hands, and told her that what she had was a photograph of a document she had no legal right to photograph, containing medical terminology she was not credentialed to interpret, relating to a man whose death had already been ruled natural by the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. "Even if everything you're saying is accurate," he had said, "you're a waitress who photographed a private document belonging to a dead man while he was in the bathroom." That is where this conversation ends, for any prosecutor in this city.
She had thanked him. She had walked back out into the November air on South Michigan Avenue and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching traffic, recalibrating. The second attempt was the police. She had called the non-emergency line, asked for the homicide division, been transferred twice, and spoken for 6 minutes to a Detective Reyes, who had taken down her name with the efficiency of a man writing a grocery list, and told her that the medical examiner's determination was final unless new physical evidence emerged, and that photographs of a document did not constitute physical evidence. He had been polite. He had been thorough. And when she hung up, she understood. With the slow,
clarifying certainty of someone who has been in this particular position before, that someone had arrived before her, not necessarily with a phone call, perhaps just with a name. The name Jang, carrying enough weight in enough offices in this city that certain avenues closed before she ever reached them, the way a river diverts around a stone that has been there long enough. The third attempt she did not finish. She had found a journalist, an investigative reporter at the Tribune, who had written 2 pieces about Korean organized crime networks in the Midwest. She had drafted a message 3 times. Each time she reached the sentence where she had to identify herself, she deleted everything and closed the window. Because Gerald Okafor had been wrong about one thing. It was not only about what she had that prosecutors would reject, it was about what they would do to her in the process of rejecting it. She had read enough to know that being right about something and surviving being right about it were 2 separate projects, and the second one required resources she did not currently possess. So she had gone to the funeral instead. She had told herself it was because the restaurant staff was expected to attend. She had told herself she needed to see the room, understand the landscape, figure out what she was actually walking into before she made any further decisions. These were not entirely untrue, but underneath them, in the place where she kept the things she did not examine too closely, was something simpler and less rational. She needed to look at the coffin. She needed to be in the same room as the fact of it, because the document she had photographed was one kind of truth, and the lacquered box in which they had placed Jang Hyeon-Soo was another kind, and she understood, in a way she could not have articulated to Gerald Okafor or Detective Reyes, that if she did not go, the second truth would bury the first one permanently. The funeral home was on North Clark Street, a building that presented itself as a dignified civic institution and was, as Naomi had learned in 40 minutes of research the previous night, owned by a property management company registered in Delaware, which was itself a subsidiary of a hospitality group incorporated in Nevada, which shared 3 board members with the holding company that operated the Beck Clan restaurant. The money had learned a long time ago how to wear a suit and look boring. She arrived with 7 other members of the restaurant staff, all of them dressed in careful, expensive black, all of them carrying that particular expression of respectful neutrality that the Beck Clan seemed to produce in its employees, the way other workplaces produced familiarity or camaraderie. They signed a guest register at the entrance. Naomi wrote her name in her clearest handwriting. The main hall was enormous and cold, with the specific coldness of rooms that are air-conditioned below comfort, as a way of reminding the body that it is in the presence of death. White lilies covered every surface, on stands, on tables, banked against the walls in arrangements so large and so precisely constructed that they looked less like flowers and more like architecture. 180 people, perhaps more, men in dark suits with the particular density of men who spend time in rooms where violence is a resource rather than a problem. Women in structured black dresses with jewelry that did not call attention to itself. A cluster of older Korean men near the front, whom Naomi had not seen before, different in bearing from the Chicago contingent, something in the way they occupied space that suggested they were accustomed to being the most significant people in any room they entered. The coffin was at the front of the hall, lacquered black, closed. Naomi stood looking at it for a long moment. She found Min Jun without having to search. He was positioned near the entrance to the inner hall, receiving condolences with a practiced gravity. The slight bow, the two-handed handshake, the measured eye contact that communicated grief without surrendering composure. He was 32 and looked younger, in the way that men who have never been uncertain about their position in the world sometimes do. The gray suit was cut without a single unnecessary line. The Richard Mille watch caught the light in the particular way of objects that cost more than most people's annual income and are worn without awareness of this, which is, itself, the most expensive thing about them. His eyes moved across the room with the regularity of a security camera, not nervous, not searching, simply accounting. Cataloging who was present, where they stood, whether the spatial arrangements of the room matched his expectations. It was the behavior of someone who had thought carefully about this day. When his gaze reached Naomi, it paused for exactly as long as it took him to categorize her. Waitress from the restaurant. Staff attendants. Expected. His eyes moved on. She had been dismissed in under 2 seconds. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the way Marcus had been dismissed in the waiting room of Northwestern Memorial for 4 hours, while the cardiac event that was killing him was categorized as anxiety, and how she had sat beside him telling him he was fine, that they would see someone soon, that this was how hospitals worked, right up until the moment he lost consciousness in a plastic chair, and it was too late for the categorization to matter anymore. The thing about being dismissed, Naomi had learned, was that it only worked if you accepted the terms of the dismissal. If you stayed in the category you'd been placed in, if you continued to move like water around furniture and keep your eyes where they were trained to go. She reached into her bag. Her fingers found the folded prints. 6 pages, printed that morning at the FedEx on Halsted Street, slightly warm from the machine, the weight of them now familiar from the number of times she had taken them out and put them back in the previous 48 hours. She walked to the center of the hall. She stood in front of the closed black coffin with its white lilies and its locked silence, and she felt the particular quality of attention that a room gives when it has not yet decided whether what is happening is a disruption or a ceremony. I need someone to open this coffin. Her voice was level, not loud. The room was quiet enough that she did not need loud. Right now, because the man inside it was not killed by a cardiac arrest, and I have the documentation that proves it. The sound that followed was not chaos. It was something more unsettling than chaos. The absolute suspension of 180 people simultaneously choosing not to move, not to speak, not to breathe any more than was strictly necessary while they waited to understand what kind of moment this was going to turn out to be. Min-jun had already begun to move toward her. She could see him at the edge of her vision. Not rushing, because men like him did not rush. Because rushing was a form of acknowledgement. Moving with that same deliberate spatial efficiency she had watched him apply to the room all evening. Two others broke from the walls in her peripheral vision, large men in dark clothing, whose function was immediately legible. And then, from the cluster of older men near the front of the hall, a single hand went up. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the kind of hand raise that a man uses when he is accustomed to the fact that his hands, when raised, stop things. A small motion with absolute authority behind it. The two men from the walls stopped. Min-jun stopped. The old man, she would learn his name later, Jang Hyeon-Soo, older brother, flown in from Seoul 40 hours ago, turned from the front of the hall and looked at Naomi across the full length of the room. His face gave nothing, but he looked at her for a long time, with the careful attention of someone reading a document in a language they have not used in many years. And when he finally spoke, it was in Korean, and it was quiet, and Naomi did not understand a single word of it. The woman beside her, Kim Soo-ah, the restaurant's administrative assistant, who had been standing with the staff group and was now standing very still with the pallor of someone who has just heard something in their native language that they would have preferred to hear in no language at all, leaned slightly toward Naomi and whispered. He said, "Let the woman speak. If she is lying, she will die. If she is telling the truth—" A pause. Kim Soo-ah swallowed. "Let her speak." The room had the quality of a held breath that does not know yet whether it will be released as relief or as a scream. Naomi did not move. She had learned, in the years since Marcus, that the most dangerous thing a person in her position could do in a moment like this was to mistake stillness for safety and begin filling it with words. Words, once released into a room like this one, could not be recalled. They would be weighed, sorted, measured against other words that had been spoken in other rooms she had not been present for, and the outcome of that weighing would happen without her participation. So she stood with the prints in her hand and waited, and let Jang Hyeon-Soo cross the length of the hall toward her in his own time, at his own pace, which was the pace of a man who had never once in his life been required to hurry toward anything. He was 65 years old, and looked simultaneously older and more durable than that suggested. The kind of man whose face had been arranged by decades of specific pressures into something that no longer registered as young or old, but simply as settled. He wore a black suit that was not expensive the way Min-jun's was expensive, not in the way of display, but expensive in the way of a thing that has been made by someone who understood the body inside it and had no interest in being noticed. He wore no watch. His hands, when he reached her and extended one for the documents, were the hands of a man who had done physical work at some point in his life and had not forgotten that he'd done it. She gave him the prints. He read without expression. Not performing expressionlessness, simply not expressing, the way a doctor reads a chart, because the information was the thing, and response was for later. He read each page with the same attention, including the last one, the one with the red handwritten notation, which he held slightly longer than the others. Then he lowered the papers and looked at Naomi, and she understood from his eyes that he was not deciding whether to believe her. He was deciding something else entirely, something with more moving parts and a longer timeline, and she was one variable in a calculation she could not see the full architecture of. He turned to Min-jun. The name came out of him quietly, with no added weight, no performance of accusation, just the name. 2 syllables in a voice that had clearly spoken that name 1,000 times before, over dinners and holidays and meetings of the kind that did not appear in any corporate minutes. Min-juna. Min-jun had stopped moving the moment Hyun-Chol's hand had gone up. He had remained stopped, which was, Naomi recognized, its own kind of movement, the careful management of a stillness that was doing a great deal of work. He was 32 years old, and he had the face of a man who had built his entire life on the premise that his composure was impenetrable, that the glass he had placed between himself and the world was thick enough to be invisible. She watched that glass develop its first fracture at the sound of his name in his uncle's voice. It was not guilt that cracked it, or not only guilt. It was recognition, the specific recognition of a person who has built something very carefully and has just heard the sound of someone else who understands exactly what was built and why, and is not impressed by the construction. Min-jun said nothing. He looked at the prints in Hyun-Chol's hand, and then he looked past them, at some middle distance above and behind Naomi's left shoulder, with the expression of a man who is performing the act of thinking while actually doing something else entirely. Reviewing, she suspected, the various architectures of exit. Hyun-Chol turned back to the room. What happened in the next 4 minutes happened with the procedural efficiency of a man executing a plan he had already made before he walked into the building. He spoke to 2 of the older men from the Seoul contingent in a low, rapid Korean. One of them left the room immediately, phone already at his ear. The second moved to a position near the main entrance, not blocking it, just occupying it, the way a key occupies a lock. Hyun-Chol then turned to the room at large and said something brief and absolute that Naomi did not need translated because the response was universal. 180 people began moving toward the exits with the quiet, orderly acceleration of people who have been told that remaining is not a choice they want to make. Within 6 minutes, the hall held 4 people: Naomi, Hyun-Chol, Min-jun, and Kim Soo-ah, who had remained because her feet appeared to have made the decision without consulting her, and because Naomi's hand had found her arm at some point in the previous minutes and had not released it. The coffin remained at the front of the room, still closed. The lilies around it looked different now, less like mourning and more like evidence. Hyun-Chol made a phone call. He spoke for less than 90 seconds. When he ended the call, he looked at Naomi and said, in English that was accented but precise, 40 minutes. She nodded. Those 40 minutes were the strangest of her life. The 4 of them existed in the hall with the specific awkwardness of people who have no script for what they are currently inside. Hyun-Chol sat in the front row of chairs and did not speak. Kim Soo-ah sat beside Naomi near the back and did not speak. Min-jun stood near the right wall and also did not speak, which was the loudest silence in the room, a silence that was doing continuous structural labor, holding something in that was pressing hard against the inside of his composure. It was Naomi who broke it, not because she'd planned to, because she looked at him standing there with his Richard Mille and his perfect gray suit and his fracturing glass, and she thought about how he had looked at her earlier. That 2-second dismissal, the categorical glance that saw waitress and moved on. And she understood that she had something to say to him that had nothing to do with the document, or the coffin, or the digoxin, something that had been accumulating in her for much longer than 48 hours. "You thought I wouldn't do anything," she said. "When you saw me earlier, you looked at me and you thought, that's nobody. That's not a problem." Min-jun turned his head toward her slowly. His expression was careful. "I'm not criticizing the logic," Naomi continued. "I understand the logic. I've been not a problem my whole life. It's a role I know very well." She paused. "But the thing about being invisible for a long time is that you get very good at seeing. And you," she looked at him steadily, "were not careful around invisible people." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not regret, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that might have been regret if it had more room to breathe. Then he looked away. The private forensic team arrived in 38 minutes. 4 people in professional dark clothing, carrying cases that suggested both medical equipment and the kind of discretion that is purchased at a specific price point. They worked with the efficiency of people who had been briefed in transit. Hyun-Chol stood at the front of the room throughout. Naomi stayed near the back with Kim Soo-ah, who had progressed from pallor to a kind of focused calm, as though the strangeness of the situation had exceeded the capacity of her anxiety to process it, and she had defaulted to simply watching. Naomi did not watch the coffin. She watched Min-jun. He had moved at some point to a chair near the right wall and sat in it with his elbows on his knees and his head down. Not defeated, she thought. Not yet. But recalculating. Running the numbers on a situation whose variables had changed substantially in the last 40 minutes. She recognized the posture because she had sat in it herself, on a plastic chair outside a hospital room in which Marcus was already gone, running numbers on a situation that had no solution she had arrived at fast enough to matter. The difference was that Min-jun's numbers were about escape routes, and hers had been about grief. The lead forensic examiner came to Hyeon-Chol first, spoke quietly, showed him something on a tablet. Hyeon-Chol looked at it without touching it, then turned away and was still for a long moment. The first moment of stillness she had seen from him that was not controlled, that was not the managed stillness of a man who had decided to be still. This was something happening to him rather than something he was doing. Then he straightened. He crossed the room to where Naomi sat. He stood before her, not looming, not intimidating, simply present, and said, in his precise, accented English, "The compound is consistent. The concentration is consistent. The notation," he glanced at the prints he still held, "matches." Naomi said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment with that same reading expression, the one that was working through something in a language it had not used recently. "How did you know what it meant? The document?" "My brother," she said. "I learned to read those words because of my brother. It didn't help him." She paused. "I thought maybe it could help someone." Hyeon-Chol was quiet, then, "My brother trusted very few people. He was not a trusting man by nature or by profession. He folded the prints once and held them. He left that portfolio open. It was not a question, but it landed like one." Naomi felt the thing she had been holding at a careful distance for 48 hours, the thing she had not let herself fully think because thinking it made it real, arrive in her chest with a weight she had not anticipated. She had known, on some level. She had known since the train ride home, since she had turned off her phone screen and watched the city go past, and felt the difference between a document that had been carelessly left and a document that had been placed. She had known, and she had not known, because knowing it fully meant understanding the size of what he had asked of her without asking. He had watched her for 3 years, moving like water, noticing everything, never saying a word, and then he had left her a door and hoped she would choose to open it. She exhaled slowly. "He knew I would read it." Hyeon-Chol said nothing, but something in his expression, the first softening she had seen in it, small and brief as a match flaring in wind, confirmed it. From across the room, Min-jun's voice came low and unsteady, stripped of its performance of calm for the first time. "Why did you come here?" He was looking at Naomi, not with anger, with something rawer than anger, the genuine incomprehension of a man who had built his entire model of the world on the assumption that people like her made calculations like his, weighed risk against reward, protected themselves. "You could have disappeared. You had nothing to gain." Naomi looked at him across the quiet hall, with its white lilies and its open coffin, and its 48 hours of accumulated truth. "I had a brother," she said, "who died while I stayed quiet. I'm not doing that again." The federal agents arrived before the lilies had time to wilt. Naomi would learn later, much later, in pieces, the way truth tends to arrive when it has traveled through institutional channels, that Hyeon-Chol had made a second call during those 40 minutes. One she had not heard because it had happened in Korean, in a low voice near the front of the hall, while the forensic team worked. That call had gone to a number in Washington, D.C., that was not listed under any government directory, but was answered within 2 rings by a man who had been waiting, in the specific way of men who work in federal buildings, and monitor specific names on specific lists for exactly this kind of development. The relationship between Jang Hyeon-Soo and that particular number was not one that had been formed recently. It was the kind of relationship that accumulates over years of mutual usefulness, the kind where each party holds something the other needs, and both parties are too pragmatic to pretend otherwise. What Hyun-Chol had held for a very long time was information. What he wanted, in exchange for that information in its most complete and actionable form, was for his brother's death to be adjudicated not by the code of the organization, which would have handled Min-jun in its own way, quickly and without paperwork, but by a court, a public record, a sentence that would exist in documents that could not be revised by men with enough money to revise most things. This was, Naomi understood when she eventually understood it, the second layer of what Hyeon-Soo had built. The document in the portfolio was the first layer, the forensic foundation, the physical proof, the thing that could not be argued away once it was in the right hands. But the right hands had to be identified and activated, and that required someone with a different set of resources than a waitress from Pilsen with photographs on her phone. It required his brother, who had flown from Seoul not to mourn, but to complete a transaction that Hyeon-Soo had initiated before his heart stopped. The Tigre Frio had not simply died. He had constructed his death the way he had apparently constructed everything else in his life, as a multi-stage operation with redundancies and contingencies and a clear objective. The objective was not survival. He had known by the time he commissioned the private toxicological screening that survival was no longer available to him. Min-jun had been careful, but not careful enough to prevent his father from recognizing the early symptoms for what they were: the slight cardiac irregularity, the specific fatigue pattern, the way his appetite had shifted in the weeks since his son had begun personally overseeing the preparation of his meals at the family residence. He had known, and he had chosen not to run, not to confront, not to deploy any of the considerable force available to a man of his position against his own child. He had chosen instead to build something, a case assembled with the patience of a man who understood that justice, when it came from outside the organization rather than from within it, was permanent in a way that internal resolution never was. Min-jun, dealt with by the organization's own mechanisms, would simply disappear, a fact, but not a record. Min-jun, dealt with by a federal court, would become a document, would become evidence, would become the kind of precedent that made certain future arrangements more difficult for the people who inherited the architecture of the organization. Hyun-Soo had loved his son. Naomi had no doubt of this. She had seen it in the single unguarded moment when Min-jun's composure had cracked at the sound of his uncle's voice, had seen in that crack the reflection of a relationship that had been real before it became a liability. The love did not change the calculation. If anything, it was the reason the calculation had taken the form it did. A man who did not love his son might have simply had him killed. Hyun-Soo had done something harder and stranger. He had handed his son to a system that would outlast both of them. And he had needed a witness. Not a professional, not someone embedded in the organization, someone whose testimony would be dismissed as self-interested or contaminated by the same structures that produced the crime. He had needed someone ordinary, someone whose presence in that restaurant was explicable by nothing more than the need to pay rent. Someone who had, through a combination of personal history and professional discipline, developed precisely the right knowledge to read a document that most people in her position would have replaced without registering. He had watched her for 3 years. He had observed the quality of her attention, the way she moved through rooms that contained dangerous information without being destroyed by them, the way she looked without appearing to look, the way she filed things away with the patience of someone who had learned that the right moment to use what you knew was rarely the moment you learned it. He had perhaps also observed, in the way that men who have survived by reading people tend to observe the losses that have shaped a person, that she carried something unresolved. Something that made her the kind of person who would not, when given a second chance to act, choose silence again. He had left the portfolio open. It was, Naomi thought, sitting in the back of a black SUV with a federal agent named Carver, who had the demeanor of a man who had been briefed thoroughly and was going to ask her everything anyway. The most precise act of trust she had ever been the recipient of. Not because it was warm. It was not warm. It was cold and careful, and it had placed her in significant danger without her consent. But it was trust in the most functional sense, the sense of a person betting their last meaningful action on their accurate read of another person's character. She had not failed him. She was not sure how she felt about that. Agent Carver was methodical. He worked through her account in chronological order, asking her to repeat certain sections, asking her to clarify the specific sequence of what she had seen and when, at one point spending 11 minutes on the precise position of the portfolio on the table and the exact pages she had photographed, and in what order. Naomi answered everything. She was, she realized, very calm. Not the performed calm of the restaurant, but something genuine, something that had settled into her in the last several hours, like sediment finding the bottom of still water. When Carver finished his initial pass, he closed his notebook and looked at her with an expression that was professional, but not unkind. "You understand what the next several months are going to look like for you. I understand that I'll need to testify. Testify, yes, and be visible in ways that will be uncomfortable. There are people in Min-Jun Jang's network who are going to want to understand exactly how this happened and exactly who was involved." He paused. "We can offer protection." "I know," she said. "I'll need it." He nodded. "You could have gone to the press. You could have posted those photographs. You chose not to." "The press couldn't open the coffin," she said. Carver was quiet for a moment. "No," he agreed. "It couldn't." Min-Jun was taken from the funeral home in a car she did not see leave. She heard the door of the building open and close at some point during her conversation with Carver, and she heard the sound of more than one vehicle departing, and she understood from the quality of the subsequent silence that the hall was now empty of everyone except her and the federal presence and the forensic team, who were still working with the careful attention of people who understood that what they documented tonight would be read by people in rooms they would never enter. She did not see Min-Jun again that night. She would see him once more, 8 months later, in a federal courtroom on South Dearborn Street, where she would sit in the witness box for 2.5 hours and answer questions about a Tuesday evening in a restaurant and a leather portfolio and 6 pages of private toxicological documentation. She would give her answers in the same level voice she had used to announce herself in the funeral hall, and she would not look at the defense table, and then she would, and when she did, she would find Min-Jun already looking at her, not with anger, not with the calculating gaze of a man still running exit scenarios, but with something she could not entirely name. Something that might, in a different person, in a different life, have been a form of acknowledgement. She looked back at the prosecutor and continued her testimony. The conviction came 3 months after that. 22 years, no parole for 11. The sentencing judge made a remark that was reported in the Tribune the following morning. A single sentence in the middle of a longer statement about organized crime and the limits of inherited impunity, which said, "The mechanism by which this crime was discovered reflects a form of moral courage that this court will not reduce to the language of luck." Naomi read it on her phone on the train. She was on her way to a class at the University of Illinois Chicago College of Pharmacy, where she had enrolled 6 weeks after the funeral, funded by a trust she had been informed of in a letter from a Seoul law firm that arrived on a Tuesday morning with no cover note and no explanation beyond the trust's terms and the name of its originator. She had not known how to feel about the money. She still did not, entirely. It was the inheritance of a man she had never spoken more than 4 sentences to at once, left to her not as payment, but as consequence, the downstream effect of a decision she had not known she was making when she bent to pick up scattered pages from a restaurant booth. She had thought about declining it. She had thought about it for 3 days, and then she had thought about the pharmacology textbook she had been reading secondhand for 7 years, and she had enrolled. The trust was sufficient for the full program. Hyeon-Soo had been, among other things, precise. On the morning of her first day of classes, standing on the platform at the Halsted station in the blue November cold with her new bag over her shoulder, a real one, leather, dark green, bought with the first disbursement from the trust with the specific deliberateness of a person purchasing a small, concrete piece of a different version of themselves, she thought about Marcus. She thought about the waiting room and the plastic chair and the 4 hours during which she had stayed quiet, because staying quiet was what the room seemed to require. She thought about the version of herself that had filed that experience away in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not paid to think about, and had carried it there for 5 years like a stone in a pocket, heavy and private and entirely hers. She thought about a man she had served twice a week for 3 years, who had watched her carry that stone, and had, in the last weeks of his life, done the only thing available to him, placed something in her path that required her to put it down. She was not grateful to him. Gratitude was too simple for what she felt, too clean, too unidirectional. What she felt was more like the awareness of a debt that had been paid in a currency she had not known she was holding. The currency of surviving your own silence long enough to break it when it counted. The train arrived. She got on. She found a seat near the window, settled her bag on her lap, and watched Chicago move past in the early morning. The gray water of the river, the geometry of bridges, the city arranging and rearranging itself, with the indifferent continuity of a place that has absorbed many private histories and will absorb many more, and keeps moving regardless. She opened her textbook to the first chapter. At the top of the page, in small print beneath the chapter title, was a line she had read before in a different context, in a different kind of document, under fluorescent lights in the back hallway of a pharmacy where she had been trying to understand how her brother had died. The dose makes the poison. Naomi read it. Then she turned the page and began. If this story moved you, stop for just a moment and reflect. Have you ever been dismissed, looked past, categorized, written off, by someone who never imagined that you were the most dangerous person in the room, because you were the only one telling the truth? Have you ever stayed silent when you knew something was wrong, and carried that silence like a weight you couldn't put down? And if you had been in Naomi's place, standing in that room, with everything to lose and nothing guaranteed, would you have opened your mouth? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about justice, courage, and the power of truth, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.